The rain tapped steadily against the window as the city moved on, its people flowing through the streets like a quiet, indifferent tide. On a worn bench just outside a bustling diner, a man sat with a coat pulled tightly around his shoulders. He looked like anyone else, a nondescript figure lost in the rhythm of the city, unnoticed and seemingly unremarkable. But this was no ordinary man, even if he did everything in his power to look that way. His name was Marcus Lane. He was older, perhaps in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair that framed a face etched with years of experience. His gaze was steady but unassuming, the kind of look that saw everything but revealed nothing in return. To the world, he was just another passerby, another quiet soul wandering through the city's endless maze of faces. Most people would pass him without a second thought. They'd dismiss the roughness in his stance or the way his hand lingered near his pocket, almost out of habit. They'd ignore the creases in his clothes or the slight scar on his left cheek, assuming he was just one more person shaped by a hard life. What they didn't see, and what he would never show, was the history hidden beneath that quiet exterior, a history so powerful it could bring an entire room to silence with a single word. Marcus was more than he seemed, but few people knew his real story. He was a man with secrets buried so deeply that even those closest to him would be shocked by the truth. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, he wasn't in the city by chance. As Marcus sat, watching the world move around him, he glanced at his watch. It was an old piece, worn with age, but still ticking as reliably as it had the day he first strapped it on. To Marcus, it was more than just a tool to measure time. It was a reminder. Every tick was a heartbeat, every minute another moment that brought him closer to a reckoning. Across the street, two men in dark uniforms stood by a patrol car, laughing and talking without a care. Their voices carried over the hum of traffic, loud and careless, punctuated by the occasional sneer. These were not men on a mission to protect and serve. No, their postures betrayed something else, an arrogance that hung around them like a bad smell, a cocky assurance that they could do as they pleased, consequences be damned. Marcus watched them, his face betraying no emotion. To anyone watching, he was just a man lost in thought. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm was brewing, slowly gathering strength. One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Harris, caught sight of Marcus and narrowed his eyes. There was a glint of something in that look, suspicion, maybe, or a hint of curiosity. He nudged his partner, a younger officer named King, and gestured subtly toward Marcus. The two of them exchanged words, their smirks widening as they watched him from across the street. Marcus could feel their gaze on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down as they assessed him from a distance. To them, he was just another nobody, someone who didn't belong in their city or on their streets, someone they could push around if they felt like it. The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched, a fleeting expression, barely noticeable, but filled with a quiet understanding. He knew these types all too well. Men who wielded power like a weapon, who saw people as stepping stones, obstacles, or tools. Men who thought they owned the world simply because they had a badge pinned to their chest. But Marcus didn't move. He just sat there, letting them look, letting them size him up as they saw fit. He was patient, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if he were waiting for something only he knew was coming. He didn't care what they thought, because he knew something they didn't. Their judgment, their arrogance, their sneers, they were meaningless. The city would swallow them whole, just as it had done to countless others before. Yet, for all his calm, there was a subtle tension in Marcus's posture, a quiet readiness that would go unnoticed to anyone but the most observant. It was the kind of alertness that came from years of knowing danger, from living a life where trust was rare, and every second mattered. He wasn't here by accident. His presence tonight was deliberate, a step in a plan that had been in motion for far longer than these two officers could ever imagine. The rain grew heavier, filling the streets with a steady drumbeat as the officers made their way toward him. Their steps were confident, bordering on cocky, as if they'd already decided how this encounter would play out. As they closed the distance, Harris called out, his voice cutting through the damp night air. "Hey, old man, you got business out here, or are you just loitering?" Marcus looked up, meeting Harris's gaze with a calm that was almost unnerving. He said nothing, just stared, letting the silence hang between them like a challenge. Harris bristled, clearly unaccustomed to someone ignoring his authority. Kane shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing between Marcus and his partner. "I asked you a question," Harris continued, his voice louder now, tinged with impatience. Slowly, Marcus rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and measured. He wasn't a tall man, nor particularly imposing, but there was a weight to him, a quiet strength that made Harris hesitate, if only for a second. Marcus met his gaze, his expression calm, almost detached, as if he were looking right through him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The city moved around them, cars honking, rain pouring, the world oblivious to the silent battle of wills playing out on that small patch of sidewalk. Then, without warning, Marcus broke the silence. "I'm here on business," he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority that seemed out of place. "And I'd advise you not to get in my way." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither officer could ignore. Harris frowned, clearly taken aback, while Kane shifted nervously, glancing around as if hoping someone else would intervene. "Listen here, old man," Harris started, his tone turning hostile. "You don't get to tell us what to do. We're the law around here, not you." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. He looked at Harris with a mixture of pity and disappointment, as if he'd seen this act 1,000 times before. "The law," he repeated softly, a hint of irony coloring his words. "You think a badge gives you power." Harris clenched his jaw, his face reddening with anger. But before he could respond, Marcus turned and began to walk away, his steps slow and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. The officers watched him go, momentarily stunned by his defiance, their authority questioned in a way they hadn't expected. As Marcus disappeared into the night, the rain still falling steadily around him, one thing became clear: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He was here for a reason, and whatever it was, it would bring him face to face with the very people who had underestimated him for too long. The city might have ignored him, the officers might have mocked him, but Marcus Lane was a man with a purpose, and sooner or later they'd all realize that no one should ever be judged by what lies on the surface. The diner was packed that night, the warm light spilling out onto the dark streets, drawing in everyone looking for a place to escape the rain. Inside, laughter and conversation mixed with the clinking of glasses and the sizzle of food on the grill. It was the kind of place where people came to feel at home, a small pocket of comfort in a world that could be unforgiving. But for Marcus Lane, comfort was a luxury he'd learned to live without. He had chosen a seat in the far corner, a quiet spot that gave him a view of the entire room without drawing attention. It was a habit he had picked up long ago, a way of blending in while still keeping an eye on everything around him. As he sat there, minding his own business, he couldn't help but notice the two officers from earlier. They were still lingering near the entrance, their eyes scanning the room, as if they were looking for something or someone. Officer Harris, tall and broad-shouldered with a permanent smirk, seemed to carry himself with a cocky self-assurance that came from years of unchecked power. His partner, Officer King, was younger, less experienced, but eager to follow Harris's lead. Together, they made a formidable pair, each one feeding off the other's bravado. And tonight, it seemed, Marcus was their target. The officers approached him with casual arrogance, their expressions a mix of disdain and suspicion. They stood over him, casting shadows across his table, their presence a silent reminder of who held the power in this small space. Harris's gaze was cold and assessing, the kind of look that reduced people to whatever label he'd already decided to assign them. "You're still here, huh?" Harris said, a sneer playing on his lips. "Guess you didn't get the hint earlier." Marcus looked up, his face calm and unreadable. He didn't respond, simply meeting Harris's gaze with a quiet steadiness that seemed to throw the officer off balance, if only for a moment. Harris's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, his sneer deepening as he leaned in closer. "You think you're tough, don't you?" Harris continued, his voice low and taunting. "Sitting here like you own the place, but you don't belong here. People like you." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before, seen that look of contempt in countless faces over the years. Men like Harris thrived on intimidation, on the power to make others feel small. But Marcus had long ago decided that no one could make him feel small. Not anymore. Kane shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. He seemed less confident than his partner, his bravado wavering in the face of Marcus's calm silence. But Harris wasn't deterred. He leaned in even closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Harris chuckled, clearly enjoying the one-sided exchange. "Or maybe you're just too stupid to understand what I'm saying." Marcus's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet strength that hinted at far more than he was letting on. He'd learned long ago that words only held the power he gave them, and he wasn't about to let Harris's taunts affect him. Still, he knew that men like Harris didn't back down easily. The more he ignored them, the harder they pushed. Harris glanced over at King, a silent message passing between them. The younger officer hesitated, then nodded, his expression a mixture of reluctance and determination. Together, they moved to sit across from Marcus, their presence a deliberate invasion of his space. It was a show of dominance, a reminder that they were in control, that he was just another nameless face in a world they believed they owned. "You've got a lot of nerve, sitting here like you belong," Harris sneered, folding his arms as he settled into the booth. "You think you're special? Think you're someone important?" Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze steady as he met Harris's eyes. There was a calm intensity in his expression, a quiet resilience that spoke volumes without saying a word. He didn't need to prove anything to these men, didn't need to rise to their bait. He'd seen men like them before, and he knew that their power was nothing more than a fragile illusion. Harris seemed to sense this, his smirk fading as he realized his words weren't having the desired effect. Frustration flickered in his eyes, a spark of anger that betrayed his need for control. He wasn't used to being ignored, wasn't accustomed to people standing their ground in the face of his authority. "You think this is a joke?" Harris snapped, his tone hardening. "We can make things very uncomfortable for you, old man. One call, and you'll be spending the night in a cell. How'd you like that?" Marcus tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. He could see through Harris's bluster, could sense the insecurity hidden beneath the surface. Men like Harris clung to their power, afraid of anyone who didn't fall in line, who didn't cower in their presence. And Marcus was not about to cower. The tension between them hung thick in the air, a silent battle of wills that neither man was willing to break. The diner seemed to grow quieter, the background noise fading as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was soft but firm, each word carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," he said quietly, his tone calm yet laced with an undercurrent of something far more dangerous. Harris blinked, momentarily thrown off by the quiet authority in Marcus's voice. But he quickly recovered, his expression hardening as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, I think I understand just fine," he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're just another nobody, an old man with a chip on his shoulder, thinking he can stand up to people like us." Marcus's lips twitched, a barely noticeable smile that hinted at something deeper, something far beyond Harris's comprehension. He held the officer's gaze, his calm unbroken, his strength unwavering. "Believe what you want," Marcus said softly. "But remember this, you have no idea what I'm capable of." For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Harris's face. He quickly covered it with a sneer, but the damage was done. Deep down, he knew he was in the presence of someone who couldn't be intimidated, someone who carried a strength that went far beyond physical power. King shifted in his seat, glancing between Harris and Marcus, his expression conflicted. He seemed to sense the shift in the air, the subtle change in dynamics that had tipped the scales in Marcus's favor. But Harris wasn't ready to admit defeat. He was too proud, too invested in his own sense of superiority to back down. "Let me make something clear," Harris said, his voice low and menacing. "This is our city. We decide who stays and who goes. And people like you, you're not welcome here." Marcus's gaze hardened, a steely resolve replacing the calm in his eyes. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper, but each word cutting through the tension like a knife. "Your city," he repeated, his tone filled with quiet defiance. "You may think you own this place, but power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from something far deeper than that, something you clearly don't understand." Harris clenched his jaw, his face reddening with anger. He was losing control, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. And in that moment, Marcus knew he had won. He had shown Harris that true power couldn't be taken, couldn't be forced. It came from within, from a place of strength and resilience that no one could touch. As Harris and King finally stood up, their faces dark with frustration, Marcus remained seated, his calm unbroken. He watched them walk away, their retreat a silent admission of defeat. And as they disappeared into the night, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. The conflict between them was far from over, but he was ready. He had faced men like them before, and he would face them again. Because no matter how much they tried to control him, to belittle him, they would never understand the strength that lay hidden beneath his quiet exterior. As days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself crossing paths with officers Harris and King more often than he would have liked. Each encounter seemed carefully timed, as if the two officers were lying in wait, ready to pounce at every opportunity. They grew bolder with each passing day, their actions laced with an unspoken contempt, an arrogance that spoke to the power they believed they held over him. It began with small things, subtle moves that could easily go unnoticed. An unexpected ticket on his car, parked perfectly within the lines. A warning for loitering when he was simply waiting for a bus. Even the casual glances they threw his way, as if sizing him up, reminded him that he was under their watch. To them, Marcus was just a nobody, a thorn they were intent on removing from their otherwise pristine world. Marcus, however, was patient. He took each slight in stride, his face an unreadable mask, his expression calm, almost detached. To any onlooker, he appeared indifferent, as if he'd resigned himself to their harassment. But beneath that calm exterior, Marcus was observing, taking note of every word, every move, every look of disdain. He saw the way Harris's face twisted with satisfaction whenever he managed to throw a new obstacle in Marcus's path, how King glanced nervously between them, always following Harris's lead but with an unease that hinted at doubt. There was a reason Marcus didn't react. He was watching, waiting, his silence a calculated choice. He was a man who understood patience, who knew that some battles required not a show of strength, but a quiet resolve. And though the officers couldn't see it, each word they spat, each sneer, only added fuel to the quiet fire simmering within him. One evening, as Marcus was walking home, he noticed a familiar shape in his path. A police cruiser parked across the sidewalk, blocking his way. Harris leaned against the car, arms crossed, his smirk as wide as ever. King stood beside him, shuffling uncomfortably, his eyes darting around, avoiding Marcus's steady gaze. "You lost, old man," Harris called out, his tone mocking, laced with a forced friendliness that only made the insult sting more. Or maybe you're just looking for trouble." Marcus paused, his gaze moving from Harris to King and back again. He said nothing, merely raising an eyebrow, his face betraying no emotion. Harris took a step closer, closing the distance between them, his eyes glinting with a predatory satisfaction. "Seems like you're always where you don't belong," Harris continued, his voice low and menacing. "People like you. You think you can just walk around, doing as you please. But we're here to keep the peace, make sure folks like you don't get too comfortable." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching, his silence a challenge that only seemed to anger Harris more. But beneath that quiet exterior, he was taking mental notes, observing the way Harris's hand hovered near his holster, the twitch in King's jaw, the subtle shift in their posture that betrayed their own insecurities. He was cataloging every detail, storing it away for a moment that he knew would come. Days passed, and each encounter grew more intense. The officers seemed to take his silence as a challenge, as if his lack of reaction was an insult they couldn't ignore. Harris, in particular, grew bolder, his taunts sharper, his actions more blatant. He began to follow Marcus, showing up at odd times, always with a sneer and a new insult ready on his tongue. Sometimes he'd corner Marcus in a deserted alley, other times he'd call him out in the middle of a crowded street, his voice loud and mocking, drawing the eyes of passers-by who watched but said nothing. Marcus, however, remained unmoved. Each time Harris confronted him, he would stand there, silent and steady, his face expressionless, as if he were simply waiting for the officer to tire himself out. And each time, Harris walked away with a sneer, his frustration evident in the way he clenched his fists, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. King, meanwhile, began to show cracks in his composure. He would glance at Marcus, his eyes flickering with something that almost resembled pity or regret. But each time, Harris's presence would pull him back, his own sense of duty clouded by loyalty to his partner. Marcus took note of this too, filing it away with all the other details he was collecting. Then, one night, the tension reached a boiling point. It was late, and the city was quiet, the streets deserted save for the occasional distant hum of traffic. Marcus was heading home, his footsteps echoing softly against the pavement, when he felt the familiar prickling of eyes on his back. He didn't turn, didn't react, but he knew without looking that Harris and King were there, lurking in the shadows, watching his every move. "Out a bit late, aren't you, Marcus?" Harris's voice sliced through the silence, smooth and mocking. Marcus slowed, turning slightly to see the two officers stepping into the dim glow of a street lamp. Harris's face was twisted in a grin that held no warmth, only malice, while King stood beside him, his expression tense, uncertain. "I'm not breaking any laws," Marcus replied evenly, his voice calm, steady, as if he were merely making an observation. Harris chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe not. But people like you, you're always up to something, aren't you? Always stirring the pot, thinking you're above the law." Marcus said nothing, his gaze unwavering, his silence a quiet defiance that only seemed to feed Harris's anger. "I think we're going to have to take you in," Harris continued, his tone shifting from mocking to menacing. "Just a little precaution. Make sure you're not causing trouble. You know how it is. Can't be too careful these days." King shifted, glancing at his partner with a hint of hesitation. "Harris, maybe we should just let it go. He hasn't done anything." Harris shot him a look, his eyes narrowing. "You going soft on me, King? This guy's been asking for it since day one. It's about time we showed him who's in charge around here." Marcus observed the exchange, his gaze flicking between the two officers, noting the tension between them. He could see the doubt creeping into King's eyes, the hesitation that betrayed his discomfort with Harris's actions. It was a small crack in their partnership, a tiny fissure that Marcus knew would only grow with time. Without warning, Harris stepped forward, reaching out to grab Marcus by the arm. His grip was rough, tight, a display of force that spoke to the power he believed he held. But Marcus didn't flinch. He simply looked at Harris, his expression calm, unyielding, as if he were the one in control. "You think you can just walk around like you own this place?" Harris sneered, his face inches from Marcus. "You're nothing, you understand. Nothing." Marcus held his gaze, his silence a quiet challenge, a reminder that true strength didn't come from brute force or loud words. It came from something deeper, something that couldn't be taken away, no matter how hard Harris tried. Harris's face twisted with frustration, his grip tightening as he searched for a reaction, some sign of fear or submission. But Marcus remained steady, his expression unreadable, his gaze unwavering. "You're going to regret this," Harris muttered, his voice low, filled with a threat that carried no weight in the face of Marcus's calm. As Harris finally released him, pushing him back with a sneer, Marcus took a step back, adjusting his coat with quiet dignity. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the officer's words. He simply looked at them, a faint glimmer of something in his eyes, a promise, a silent assurance that he was far from finished. As he turned to walk away, Marcus felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He had let them push him, had endured their taunts, their threats, their displays of power. But with each encounter, he'd been gathering information, observing their weaknesses, cataloging every detail for the moment he knew would come. Harris and King might have seen him as a target, a nuisance to be dealt with, but Marcus knew better. He was more than they could imagine, stronger than they could understand. And soon enough, they would learn the truth. The trap was set, each encounter bringing them closer to a reckoning they couldn't see. And as Marcus disappeared into the night, he'd allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, because he knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that the balance of power was shifting, and when the time came, he would be ready.